Imagine a civilization of unparalleled grandeur, rising from the swamps to build a city of staggering beauty and complexity, commanding an empire stretching across vast lands, a culture rich in art, science, and spiritual devotion, yet one whose very social fabric was perceived by its invaders to be woven with threads of the arcane, the forbidden, and the profoundly bizarre. What if the downfall of such a mighty empire wasn't solely due to steel blades or unseen plagues, but was subtly undermined and ultimately justified by practices considered so alien, so utterly shocking, that they fueled the righteous fervor of its destroyers? Tonight, we delve into one of history's most controversial and misunderstood narratives, the perceived bizarre sexual practices that, through a confluence of cultural clash, propaganda, and brutal conquest, played a chilling, if indirect, role in the destruction of the mighty Aztec Empire. To truly grasp the enormity of what was lost, we must first transport ourselves to the heart of the Aztec world, to the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, a marvel of engineering and urban planning built upon a lake in the Valley of Mexico. This was no primitive society. By the early 16th century, the Aztec or Mexica people had forged the Triple Alliance, creating an empire that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Ocean, dominating vast swathes of Mesoamerica. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, with its soaring temples, intricate canals, bustling markets, and causeways connecting it to the mainland, rivaled, and in many ways surpassed, the greatest cities of Europe in terms of size, cleanliness, and sophistication. It was a civilization defined by its formidable military, its profound artistic expression, its advanced astronomical knowledge, and its complex, often brutal religious practices, including human sacrifice, which we will touch upon later. The Aztec Empire was a vibrant tapestry of peoples, languages, and traditions, unified under the dominant Mexica. Their society was rigidly structured, with a powerful emperor, Moctezuma II, at its apex, supported by a vast aristocracy, priests, warriors, merchants, and a large population of commoners and serfs. Law and order were strictly enforced, education was highly valued, and a sophisticated religious cosmology guided every aspect of life, from planting crops to waging war. This was a powerful, self-sustaining world, utterly alien to anything known in the Old World. Then, in 1519, destiny, in the form of Hernán Cortés and his small band of Spanish conquistadors, arrived on the shores of Veracruz. What followed is a well-documented saga of conquest. Steel against obsidian, gunpowder against arrows, the devastating impact of European diseases like smallpox, and the crucial, often overlooked role of indigenous allies, particularly the Tlaxcalans, who chafed under Aztec domination. These factors were undoubtedly the primary direct agents of the Aztec Empire's military and political collapse. Yet, to fully understand the narrative of its destruction and the zealous brutality with which it was carried out, we must look beyond the purely military and epidemiological. We must peer into the profound cultural chasm that separated two worlds, a chasm often filled with fear, misunderstanding, and deliberate misrepresentation, particularly concerning the most intimate aspects of human society, sexuality, and gender. Now, before we proceed, let's address the provocative nature of our title: Bizarre Sexual Practices That Destroyed the Aztec Empire. This phrasing, designed to capture attention, implies a direct causal link between Aztec sexual customs and the empire's demise. Let us be clear from the outset: no reputable historian would claim that Aztec sexual practices, in and of themselves, directly caused the empire's military collapse or its demographic devastation. The primary destroyers were undeniably European diseases, superior Spanish weaponry, tactical prowess, indigenous alliances, and the strategic brilliance and ruthlessness of Cortés. However, the perception and interpretation of Aztec sexual and social norms by the Spanish played a crucial, albeit indirect, role. These practices, viewed through a lens of zealous Christian morality and European ethnocentrism, were branded as bizarre, immoral, and savage. This provided a potent ideological weapon, used by the conquistadors and chroniclers to demonize the Aztec people, justify their conquest as a righteous crusade, and legitimize the imposition of a new social, religious, and sexual order. It fueled the narrative that the Aztecs deserved their fate, and that their eradication was not merely conquest, but salvation from their own perceived depravity. So while these practices did not physically demolish buildings or slay warriors, they profoundly contributed to the destruction of Aztec autonomy, culture, and social fabric under the weight of Spanish rule. What then did the Spanish find so bizarre about Aztec sexual and social practices? We must remember that 16th century Spain was a deeply Catholic, highly conservative society, steeped in the rigid moral doctrines of the Inquisition. Any deviation from its strictures was considered sinful, often demonic. The Aztecs, by contrast, had a worldview where sexuality was interwoven with cosmology, fertility, and social order, not necessarily guilt or sin in the European sense. One of the most immediate and striking differences was the widespread practice of polygyny among the Aztec elite. While commoners were generally monogamous, noblemen and powerful warriors often had multiple wives and numerous concubines. Moctezuma Sekou himself had a principal wife, Xihuacohuatzin, and many secondary wives and concubines, often numbering in the hundreds. These unions were not merely for pleasure, but served vital political and social functions. Marrying women from allied or newly conquered city-states forged crucial alliances, cemented allegiances, and extended the emperor's influence. Children from these unions reinforced the imperial lineage and provided a vast network of connections. For the Spanish, strict monogamy was a cornerstone of Christian marriage. The concept of a ruler openly maintaining multiple wives and concubines, without the veil of secrecy or sin, was deeply scandalous. They saw it as rampant lust and immorality, a sign of barbarism and unchecked carnal desire. While polygyny itself did not destroy the empire, it often led to complex internal dynamics, rivalries among wives and their powerful families for status, influence, and the succession of their children. These internal tensions, while usually managed, could be exploited by an external force seeking to destabilize the regime. The Spanish, with their keen eye for division, recognized these networks and subtly sought to leverage them, casting the Aztec marital system as inherently unstable and morally corrupt. Beyond marital structures, the Spanish were undoubtedly horrified by elements of Aztec religious rituals that intersected with sexuality and the human body. Aztec cosmology was deeply intertwined with fertility, creation, and the cyclical nature of life and death. Deities like Xochipilli, the god of art, games, beauty, dance, flowers, and song, also had aspects related to pleasure and sacred prostitution. Tlazolteotl, the filth goddess, was revered as the patroness of carnal love, lust, and purification. Her role involved both inciting sin and cleansing it, a paradoxical concept for the Christian mind. During certain festivals, rituals dedicated to fertility gods might have involved forms of ritual nudity, symbolic sexual acts, or elements that, to the Spanish, appeared utterly depraved and blasphemous. For instance, the ritualistic wearing of flayed human skin during ceremonies dedicated to Xipe Totec, the flayed lord, was a profound shock to the Spanish, often misinterpreted as a barbaric and sexually perverse act, rather than a symbolic representation of agricultural renewal and the shedding of the old for the new. While not sexual practices in a direct sense, the ritualistic use of the body and overt displays related to fertility and carnal aspects of divinity were utterly alien to the Spanish and seen as evidence of diabolical worship and moral decay. Perhaps one of the most significant areas of cultural clash, and one that the Spanish wielded as a powerful tool of condemnation, concerned gender and what Europeans perceived as deviant sexualities. While the historical record on Aztec homosexuality and gender nonconformity is complex and often filtered through biased Spanish accounts, there is evidence that Aztec society held more fluid, or at least different understandings of gender roles and sexual expression than those rigid binary constructs of 16th century Europe. Spanish chroniclers such as Bernal Díaz del Castillo often expressed utter revulsion at what they perceived as widespread sodomy. They consistently reported that homosexual practices were prevalent, particularly among the elite, and often used this as a prime example of Aztec barbarism, justifying their actions to cleanse the land of such perceived abominations. It is crucial, however, to contextualize these accounts. Sodomy was a catch-all term for any non-procreative sexual act, and the Spanish may have misinterpreted ritualistic behaviors or simply exaggerated reports to fit their propaganda. Furthermore, some Mesoamerican cultures, and potentially the Aztecs, had roles for individuals who might be considered gender non-conforming or third gender in modern terminology. While specific Aztec terms and roles are not as clearly documented as in some other indigenous societies, the Spanish accounts often conflated these with sodomy or effeminacy, seeing them as signs of moral decay and a fundamental perversion of the natural order as defined by Christianity. For the Spanish, any deviation from strict heterosexual procreative norms was not merely a sin, but an affront to God, deserving of severe punishment and eradication. This condemnation provided a potent moral justification for their conquest, framing it as a divine mission to root out such vices and bring Christian morality to a savage land. It was not the practice itself that destroyed the empire, but the Spanish reaction to it, which fueled their destructive zeal. The Aztecs themselves had strict laws regarding sexual conduct, often more stringent than those in contemporary Europe in certain areas. Adultery, for instance, particularly for women, was punishable by death, often by stoning. Incest was forbidden, and rapists faced severe penalties. Prostitution existed, often in designated areas, and was generally regulated. However, the differences in emphasis and application were key. For the Spanish, the sin lay in the act itself, irrespective of consent or social context. For the Aztecs, the social disruption caused by the act, the violation of marital bonds, the disruption of lineage, the affront to community, was paramount. The Spanish would have viewed the severity of Aztec punishments for adultery as a contradiction, given what they perceived as widespread sexual license in other areas. This allowed them to paint the Aztec legal system as arbitrary or hypocritical, further proving their supposed barbarism. The very presence of regulated prostitution, or rituals that involved elements of sexuality, no matter how carefully circumscribed, would have been condemned as evidence of a society steeped in sin, regardless of its own internal moral code. So how did these perceived bizarre sexual practices truly contribute to the destruction of the Aztec Empire? They did not cause disease or weaken armies in a direct physical sense. Their destructive power lay in their potent contribution to the Spanish ideological framework of conquest and justification. Firstly, propaganda and dehumanization. The Spanish needed to justify their brutal actions, the slaughter, the subjugation, the destruction of a magnificent civilization. Portraying the Aztecs as barbaric, idolatrous, and sexually depraved served this purpose perfectly. Reports of sodomy, polygyny, and immoral rituals were widely disseminated, both among the conquistadors and back in Spain, constructing a narrative that painted the Aztecs as less than human, deserving of conquest and salvation through forced conversion. This dehumanization made it easier to commit atrocities, quelled potential moral qualms among the invaders, and garnered support for the conquest from the Spanish crown and the church. Secondly, religious zeal and eradication. The perceived sexual sins of the Aztecs inflamed the religious zeal of the Spanish. The conquest became not just about gold and land, but about a holy mission to stamp out perceived blasphemy and sexual deviance, alongside human sacrifice and idolatry. This led to the systematic destruction of Aztec religious artifacts, temples, and social structures, all deemed tainted by their supposed immorality. The imposition of Christian monogamy and strict sexual codes was a central component of the Spanish colonial project, fundamentally altering Aztec society and destroying their traditional familial and social bonds. Thirdly, undermining authority. By highlighting these practices as vices, the Spanish could undermine the legitimacy of Aztec leadership and priestly classes. If the emperor and nobles engaged in polygyny or tolerated what the Spanish deemed sodomy, they were morally corrupt, and their authority was illegitimate in the eyes of God. This helped to dismantle the existing power structures and replace them with Spanish rule, which claimed moral and divine superiority. Let us be clear, the overwhelming and undeniable forces that directly shattered the Aztec Empire were European diseases, smallpox, measles, and other Old World pathogens, to which the indigenous populations had no immunity, ravaged the Aztec people. Within decades, estimates suggest up to 90% of the native population perished, gutting their military, labor force, and leadership. This was the single greatest destructive force. Superior weaponry and tactics. While not as numerous, the Spanish possessed steel armor and weapons, firearms, cannons, and horses, technologies utterly unknown to the Aztecs. These gave them a decisive military advantage, creating psychological terror and physical devastation. Indigenous alliances. Cortés masterfully exploited the deep-seated resentments and rivalries among the various Mesoamerican city-states subjugated by the Aztecs. The Tlaxcalans, fierce enemies of the Mexica, provided tens of thousands of warriors, crucial intelligence, logistical support, and a sustained fighting force that the small Spanish contingent could never have matched alone. This internal division was perhaps the greatest political weakness of the empire. Moctezuma's leadership and prophecy. The emperor, Moctezuma II's initial indecision, his attempts at diplomacy, and perhaps his belief in ancient prophecies regarding the return of a feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, that some accounts suggest he associated with Cortés, are often cited as contributing to the Spanish ability to gain a foothold and eventually besiege Tenochtitlan. While the extent of this belief is debated, his actions certainly played a role in the initial Spanish successes. In the end, the Aztec Empire fell due to a convergence of devastating external forces and internal vulnerabilities, exacerbated by a profound cultural misunderstanding that was weaponized by the conquerors. The bizarre sexual practices were not a direct weapon in the Spanish arsenal, nor a disease that ravaged the Aztec body politic. Instead, they were a powerful rhetorical device, a moralistic justification that allowed the Spanish to rationalize their brutality, dehumanize their victims, and solidify their claim to a new vast empire. The destruction of the Aztec Empire was multifaceted. It was military conquest, demographic catastrophe, and a profound cultural trauma. But it was also an ideological war, where differing social and sexual norms became battlegrounds, used to delegitimize an entire civilization and pave the way for its eradication. The story of the Aztec Empire's fall is a complex and tragic tapestry, warning us of the dangers of cultural misinterpretation, the ruthlessness of imperial ambition, and the devastating power of disease. It serves as a stark reminder that history is often written by the victors, and that the bizarre in one culture can become the convenient justification for destruction in another. The Aztecs may have fallen, but their legacy, their astonishing achievements, and the echoes of their misunderstood world continue to resonate, urging us to look beyond simplistic narratives and uncover the deeper, often uncomfortable truths of history.